Thank you, worshipful brother. I want to thank you for inviting me to be here with you, brothers, this evening. As Ryan indicated, my name is Joe Kendall. I know most of you, but there's a few new faces here. I am a past master of Collegium Ritus Austera, number 779 here in Nashville, and I am presently a member of Lexington Lodge No. in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where I went through my degrees. Not at that lodge, but in Kentucky. And Ryan had asked me to come here and talk to you, as we said, a little bit about the feast day of St. John, why we feast, why we celebrate the feast days of St. John. And I'm going to actually look into that both in kind of a historical and, I think, frankly, more importantly, symbolic reason as to why we observe these feast days and kind of why we feast Masonically in general, as opposed to just eating. We've all just eaten at Lodge, and there's nothing wrong with just eating at Lodge, but there is something very special and very uniquely Masonic about the type of feasting that we're talking about here. So we'll talk a little bit about that in here, and then we'll go out there and we'll experience it. And I think there are some brothers here who might have experienced something like that before, but I think for most of us, it's going to be something a little bit new. If you're interested in seeing a little bit more of what this looks like, about this time last year, my older son and I went up to Lexington, to my lodge, which spent the better part of a weekend filming a documentary film called The Masonic Table that outlines why we feast, how we feast, and some of the general practices. That movie was released just a couple weeks ago on Amazon Prime, so if you want to check that out, it's available for you. I don't get any money off of that, so that plug doesn't put any dollars in my pocket. But it may, if you enjoy this evening, that may be someplace you can go look for a little bit more in-depth information on that. So I need to wake this up because it's not advancing. Nope, it's not. There we go. There we go. All right, so first off, why do we feast? Okay, why do we celebrate these feast days? Particularly on the dates that we do, the feast day of St. John the Baptist on June 24th and the feast day of St. John the Evangelist on December 27th. I was telling a brother outside, I always struggled to remember which one was which feast day belonged to John the Baptist, which one belonged to John the Evangelist. As I said before, I grew up in Kentucky. I was baptized in the Ohio River. Brother, I would much rather be baptized on the 24th of June than on the 27th of December. So that's the way that I recall which one is which. Well, the reason why, one of the reasons why one of these feast days is important to us is because of what happened on June 24th, 1717. This was 305 years ago and 3 days. On that date, 4 lodges, 3 of them from London, and 1 from Westminster, assembled at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern. Notice, I've got the 4 lodges listed here. They're Goose and Gridiron Lodge, Crown Ale House, Apple Tree Tavern, and Rum and Grapes Tavern. Notice a few things that are different about the names of these lodges. First and foremost is they have no numbers. Well, they have no numbers because they weren't formed under a Grand Lodge where numbers were relevant or organized. So they were just given, lodges just named themselves. And they named themselves after the taverns where they met. All 4 of those lodge names are actually the names of taverns or ale houses where these lodges met. They gathered at Apple Tree Tavern sometime in 1716 to plan this event that would happen on the feast day of St. John the Baptist the following year, at which point these 4 lodges came together and formed what was then known as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. The top 3 lodges were London lodges. The bottom one, Rummer and Grapes, was from Westminster. And interestingly enough, the top 3 lodges were primarily operative lodges. Those were primarily lodges of operative Masons, whereas Rummer and Grapes was a primarily speculative lodge. So when we think of the early Grand Lodge period, there's still this very much this counterbalance between operative and speculative Masonry going on. We've had speculative Masonry going on for at least a while, because we have records of speculative Masons receiving their degrees in England as early as the 1640s. But a lot of the Masonic lodges that were functioning at this time were still, in fact, primarily operative in nature. So, what were they trying to accomplish? Well, they had a number of goals in coming together on this date to form a Grand Lodge. One of them was to elect a Grand Master, and that honor fell on a fellow named Anthony Sayer. The other thing that they met to do was to establish that there would be an annual meeting. And this is an annual meeting not of the constituent lodges that made up this Grand Lodge, but this is the annual meeting of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. And that annual meeting was to be held every year on the feast day of St. John the Baptist. One of the other things, and they had a number of things that they were trying to accomplish here. I'm just pulling out some of the highlights. One of the other things that they were trying to accomplish was to reestablish the observation of the annual feast. This tells us two things. It tells us that there was a pre-existing custom of having an annual feast on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, because that's when these lodges met to do it. It also tells us that it had fallen out of custom to some degree, and they were trying to re-establish it. As a matter of fact, we don't have direct minutes from this. The closest we have to this meeting is recordings of events by James Anderson in his Constitution of 1723. But he details some of the things that were done, some of the regulations that were issued, and so on. It authorized this new Grand Lodge to hold other meetings more frequently. It recommended, for example, that they also have meetings on the feast day of St. John the Evangelist, which happened very soon thereafter, and to have other such regular meetings as they would like. I believe they very quickly settled on kind of a quarterly meeting process, but two of those fell on the feast days of the Saints John, as we know today. The jewel in the middle is the tricentennial jewel that the United Grand Lodge of England issued 5 years ago when they were celebrating their tricentennial. Now, this is the feast day of St. John the Baptist that we're primarily talking about here with these London and Westminster lodges. But if we want to look just a little bit to the north into Scotland, we see that the lodges in Scotland were governed by a series of documents that are referred to as the Shaw Statutes. Okay, the first Shaw Statute was written in 1598. Interestingly enough, it was dated December 28th, 1598, one day after the feast day of St. John the Evangelist. Now, the lodges in Scotland really eschewed the idea of a Grand Lodge early on. They were not real happy about this idea of a governing body over them. They're very fiercely Scottish. But the Shaw Statutes are primarily rules to govern the operative Masonic lodges, and these were primarily operative Masonic lodges functioning in Scotland at the time, and they tended, in these operative Scottish lodges in Scotland, to really be more focused on the St. John the Evangelist. In fact, in many cases, they were solely dedicated to St. John the Evangelist. We talk about our lodges being dedicated to both Saints John. Scottish constituted lodges were generally at this time dedicated to St. John the Evangelist. And one of the reasons for that stems from the Scottish patronage of the Edinburgh lodges being devoted to St. John the Evangelist. So in Edinburgh, there is a cathedral of St. Giles, which was built in like the 1100s. And within the cathedral of St. Giles is a chapel to St. John the Evangelist. This was constructed by the operative Scottish Masons in Edinburgh in the late 1300s. I believe it was 1395. So into the early 15th, late 14th and very early 15th century, these operative Masonic lodges functioning in Scotland were charged with not just the building, but the perpetual upkeep of the chapel to St. John the Evangelist. And so I think it's pretty clear that this is why they drew, at least in around Edinburgh, their patronage to St. John the Evangelist. Yep. To illustrate this John the Evangelist, John the Baptist, and so on, you have to really, it's from a historical perspective, it's really rooted in the operative nature of these lodges. This is particularly the case in Scotland. So if you look at those Shaw statutes that I referenced a couple of slides back, like I said, those were guides for how the operative lodges were supposed to function and operate. But in Great Britain as a whole, they, at this time period, they held to something that are referred to as quarter days. Has anybody ever heard of the concept of quarter days? Because it's a fairly foreign concept to us. But it's the idea that certain business is transacted at given days on the calendar year. And by business, I'm talking about the hiring of servants, the commissioning of large public works or cathedrals or chapels or this type of thing. The paying of rent. This is when rent, you didn't pay rent every month. Rent was due on the quarter day. Okay? Stuff like that. We talk about statutes of limitations on legal matters. These were tied to quarter days. Okay? You had to resolve an issue before the quarter day was over, or else it would expand its statute of limitation and so on. So if you look at these Shaw statutes, and there are a number of them, they talk about the making of prentices and so on Michaelmas. Okay, Michaelmas is one of the quarter days, and it's also known as the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, and not a holiday or a feast day that we're terribly accustomed to here in the U.S. The opposing quarter day to Michaelmas was the Feast of Annunciation, or Lady Day. And as you can tell from this, if you can read the text in the center, these quarter days fell on what we know as the solar quarters, the solstices and the equinoxes. And so for that reason, you can see that since the quarter days were applied to debts and building projects and hiring, etc., that these operatively focused lodges were kind of focused on them. And while the ones in Scotland were focused on St. John the Evangelist, and ones in England tended to be focused more on St. John the Baptist, but they have an operative root to them. Okay. However, as we see that 1717 date approaching, even in Scotland, things started to change. There's kind of an overarching shift towards something a little bit different. So by the early 1700s, by like 1701, there's a couple of lodges that we have minutes from in the early 1700s, 1701, 1706, where they start to shift away from this pairing of Michaelmas with St. John the Evangelist in Scottish lodges and replacing Michaelmas with St. John the Baptist. So they're coming a little bit more into line with their English operative brothers. And then after the events of 1717, the most famous documentation that we have concerning that early Grand Lodge period is written and published by James Anderson in 1723, the Constitutions of the Freemasons. This is about a 90-page document. Okay, the first half of it, a little over half of it, is a traditional history of Freemasonry. And I'm going to put that in quotations because what it actually is titled, that part of it, I don't think you can, you can't see it on this, is the first half of this document is called The Traditional History of Masonry from the Creation Throughout the Known Earth. And he traces the history of Masonry all the way back to Adam. And we'll go through line, you get Nimrod and all of these. Again, I emphasize the word traditional in this history, brothers. This is like reading your history books about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. This is traditional folk history, not authentic actual history. And I would caution you, when you read these and you're reading the history of Freemasonry from Anderson, understand that that's very much a traditional history. But one thing that is evident by 1723 in this is that he is making a lot of references to meetings of Masons on or about both the feast day of St. John the Baptist and the feast day of St. John the Evangelist. So Anderson Constitution is where we really start to see this kind of emergence in a documentary form of St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist coming together as being relevant and important to these Masons of the early Grand Lodge period of the early 18th century. The feast day was not something that was suggested. It was required, specifically that feast day of St. John the Baptist in those early days of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. It was a requirement. That was essentially their Grand Lodge meeting. They would meet, they would elect a new Grand Master or re-elect the sitting Grand Master. Some of the very few powers granted to the Grand Lodge in that in those early days was the power and responsibility of organizing and conducting that annual feast. Okay, the Grand Lodge didn't really have a lot of direct control over the individual subordinate lodges. Their main area of effort and exertion was in the celebration of the feast days at their annual meetings. So that's kind of a general idea of why, from a historical perspective, we reference and reverence the Saints John, both of them. But let's talk a little bit about the more symbolic rationale and meaning behind the observance of these feast days and these saints. We're all familiar with this symbol here, right? The point within the circle, bounded by two parallel lines, each associated with one of the Saints John. Here's the problem, though, brothers. The explanation that we give of this symbol falls flat at best. Okay? We talk about how our ancient brethren dedicated their lodges to King Solomon. Well, maybe. Frankly, there are still a whole lot of lodges across this planet that still dedicate their lodges to King Solomon. So that's not something that happened in the past. It's still happening today, 3 centuries after the formation of this Grand Lodge, at least. It also indicates that since the advent of Christianity, in all Christian countries, we dedicate our lodges to the Holy Saint John. Well, that doesn't hold water either, because we haven't been meeting as Freemasons since before the advent of Christianity. That came along long before we started meeting, certainly as speculative Masons, much less operative Masonic guilds. So it's a very cursory explanation of what this symbol means, and it's kind of full of historical inaccuracy. Now, I've been a student of Masonic symbolism for as long as I've been a Freemason. And it's been my experience that when you find errors in Masonic ritual, and I'm not talking about opinions that you may disagree with or stances on particular topics, I mean factual, disprovable errors in Masonic ritual or explanation, they can only be there for one of two reasons. They're either there because the brothers that wrote them didn't know what they were talking about. And if you've read Masonic ritual, you know that that doesn't fit. These were smart, educated, intellectual men. When there are errors, I believe they're there intentionally to make us dig deeper so that we can have a deeper understanding of what the symbol actually means. If you're satisfied with the explanation that's given, fine. If you look at it and go, wait a minute, that's not right. Maybe, just maybe, that was the point in the first place. There's no symbol, I think, that more adequately describes that problem than the 47th problem of Euclid. Literally every word of our explanation of that symbol is wrong. Every word. So if you dig deeper, you can find out what that symbol actually means. And I think the same thing is going on here. So let's tear it down just a little bit, and I'm not going to get too far in the weeds with this, but at the center of this particular emblem is the point within the circle. Okay? Now we describe this as being as the individual point being you, me, the individual Mason. And if we take the compasses and let one point of the compasses represent the individual, and we set the boundary line for how far we want to be able to go and transcribe a circle, this is what we get, a point within a circle. This is just simply just a circle drawn using compasses. So that makes sense, but the symbol has another significant meaning. It is the old, long-standing symbol, both astronomically and alchemically associated with the sun. This is the symbol for the sun, in other words, period, the sun in the sky. So when we look at that symbol and we see the sun in the sky, we see that it is bounded by two parallel lines. The solar implication becomes really obvious when and only when you replace those lines or associate them with a saint whose feast day is just 3 days after the summer solstice, and the other saint whose feast day is just 6 days after the summer solstice, or 3 days after Christmas Eve, okay? The inclusion of these two saints representing parallel lines that the circle just touches re-emphasizes that this is a solar symbol. This is a symbol that specifically references the sun. But you know what? Let's turn it on its side so that we get a better idea. If you place the sun within two parallel lines, but those two parallel lines run horizontally instead of vertically, what you have here, brothers, is the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. The sun is constantly going on its path between those two lines. Those two boundary lines to the north and south of the equator by 23.5 degrees in each direction make up what we call the plane of the ecliptic. That's a phrase you have heard before in this room when we talk about why the north is a place of darkness. The north is a place of darkness in Masonic symbolism because King Solomon's temple sits north of that uppermost line, and as a result, the sun is always to the south of vertical. Okay? We say the sun rises in the east. We're north of the Tropic of Cancer here as well. The sun is never taking a path from due east to due west straight overhead, ever. It can't. It's always making that circuit by way of the south, or I should say by way of the south. Okay? And as a result, any structure that's built is going to cast a shadow in that direction. Hence why the north is a place of darkness to us. The opposite is true if you are south of the Tropic of Capricorn. If you're within those two tropics in that 47 degree band centered around the equator, the sun is going to go back and forth as it, depending on what time of year it is. Sometimes it's going to be north, sometimes it's going to be south, sometimes it's going to be directly overhead, depending on where you are within that. So this represents the sun being bounded by these two tropics. It also emphasizes the nature of these saints, because St. John the Baptist is associated with water. Okay? alchemically speaking, the symbol for water is a downward pointing triangle. St. John the Baptist is a descending sign. And as a result, his feast day is on or about the solar solstice, the summer solstice, at which point the sun is at its highest point, right? And it's the longest day of the year. Beginning immediately after the summer solstice, the days get shorter. The power of the sun is descending and waning and becoming less powerful over the course of the next 6 months. This is really nicely illustrated when we look at the symbol on its side, okay? Until we get to December 21st, just before the feast day of St. John the Evangelist, at which point we're at the shortest point of the day. This is the sun at its weakest moment. This is the sun at its lowest level of power and potency, but it has nowhere there to go but up. It goes back up this circle. Okay? It is ascending out of St. John the Evangelist, who is associated with fire, the emblem of which is the upward pointing triangle. It is an ascending sign. So this is a circular path of descension and ascension. If we don't go just in a circle around the year, even though our months stay the same, we're constantly moving forward on the level of time, right? And that this illustrates what I was talking about before with the tropics and the direction of the sun overhead. I think I explained that without that. What we actually have instead of a circle, since we're moving forward in time, is a sine wave. Half a circle going down, half a circle coming up, half a circle going down, half a circle coming up. Okay? This, brethren, I put to you, is also directly connected with the tokens of Masonry. And I'd be happy to address that with you separately outside of a live stream. But I would point to you, if you're interested in this aspect of it, there's a couple of really good papers written by Brother Tom Dryber that are published in Traveling East that talk about the Holy Saint John. There's another one where he talks about the sign of Masonry, S-I-N-E, as opposed to S-I-G-N. And I hope I'm displaying to you the idea that this sine wave is just half a circle, half a circle, half a circle, half a circle in alternating ascending and descending modes. We're all very comfortable with the idea of threes within the symbols of Masonry. We've got 3 lesser lights sitting right here in front of me right now. We've got 3 stationed officers, etc. ad nauseum. But there's also a lot of twos in Masonry. There's a lot of dualities. The most obvious of which is the 2 pillars over here to my right. A lot of our symbolism centers around these 2 pillars. I pose to you, brothers, that anytime you see 2 in Freemasonry, it's really 3. Because the 2 of these pillars, for example, becomes 3 at the moment that we are passed from the degree of fellowcraft and we stand between these 2 pillars on our way to receive our wages. Right? At that moment, that is the moment that you are passed to a fellowcraft, and that is, at that moment, there are not 3 pillars or 2 pillars, there are 3 pillars. We're told that the point within the circle represents the individual Mason. If that individual Mason is the point in the center, then there's not 2 figures in this symbol, there's 3. There is you, the point within the circle, bounded on either side by the other 2 pillars of St. John the Baptist in descent, the watery sign, and St. John the Evangelist in ascent, the fire sign. And to bring that connection back to these pillars, let me repeat what these pillars represent. We know that these represent the pillars on the front of King Solomon's temple, but we also know scripturally, and Mackey reemphasizes this very well when he tells us that these pillars referenced the pillars of cloud and fire that went before the Israelites into the wilderness. to guide them through the wilderness. A pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. What is cloud but water? And what is fire but that ascending, upward pointing triangle? So these, I suggest, brothers, are just another example, another reference to these two pillars right here, with you standing in the middle as the third pillar. So whether you want to look at those as the pillars of Jachin and Boaz, as the pillars of severity and mercy, as the pillars of wisdom and strength, with you, the individual Mason, standing in the center as the pillar of beauty. And that's what I think the significance of the Saints John are. It's a solar reference. It's a connection back to this idea of the two upright pillars, with you standing in the middle, representing the middle pillar, the harmony between the two extremes. But I want to come back to that first question, why we feast. And I think, brother, the real reason for why we feast, we can get into the history of it, we can get into the symbolism of it. But at core, we feast for a very real, very practical reason. What we do in this room is sacred. This is a sacred space. What we do in here should be done with solemnity. It's not somber, it's not depressing, but it's solemn. I've often heard people say the events depicted in our lessons, in our rituals, it's a tragedy, not a comedy. And that's true. And I think that's a concise way to put it. But what we do here binds us together in brotherhood by sacred and solemn ceremonies. But men need more than sacred and solemn ceremonies to bind themselves together. They need that convivial atmosphere where they really form these bonds of friendship and brotherly love. And that's the purpose of the feast, is to keep that levity. I've often seen guys, and some of you may have seen this, some of you may have participated in this, who like to get real hazy at certain points of our ritual in here because it's fun. They try to turn it into a comedy, probably because it's the way it was done to them when they went through, and that's the way they, and I know I'm guilty of it. But I got my degrees in Kentucky. I don't need to say anything more to any of you who have seen Kentucky degrees. You know what I went through. And there is a very real urge in us that we have to fight that says, that's the way it was done to me. I need to do it to the next guy down the pike and the next guy down the pike because that's the way it's done. But brothers, I'm trying to tell you what we do in here is sacred and solemn. The levity, that primal bonding with each other, is done in that room after we're done in here. And to do, they're just like these two pillars, brothers. They're just exactly like these two pillars. One without the other is no good. You have to have both of them, and you have to have yourself in the center, drawing from both the solemnity that goes on in here and the levity that goes on out there. All of which, within the bounds of propriety as described by the compasses, so that we don't go too far and make this really sad and depressing, or make that intemperate and excessive. We are to be that middle pillar balancing out. And I'm going to wrap this up with a quote from John Bizak. John's a dear friend of mine, past master of my lodge in Lexington. And he says, in that video that I told you about that we filmed last year, he said this: the Masonic feast, the act of breaking bread together, plays an important part in creating and cementing the fraternal ties that facilitate our individual transformations into better men. It is a custom whose observance among Masons is as old as Masonry itself. This is a custom, brethren, that we have lost. We all eat at our lodges, but so few of us, raise your hand if you've ever been to a traditional Masonic festive board. Don't be shy. There's nothing. I see maybe 4 brothers in the room who have, out of a group of 25 or 30. I put it to you, the challenge before us is the same as the challenge before our brethren in 1717, to reestablish this most important pillar of our Masonic experience. And I hope that you will have such a positive experience tonight that you'll want to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, because it's not only worthy, I argue it's necessary.